Welcome to Anatomical Gangster. I am your host, Sue Hitzman. Each episode, I always work to explore paradigm shifting ideas. I talk to bold thinkers, pioneers who challenge what we know about the body, the mind, the spirit. Sometimes we're talking about AI and agriculture, but together we uncover what it takes to heal, thrive, and evolve in this modern day world. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode, and share this conversation and even leave a review. It helps more people discover these insights and lets me know that you are out there listening. And I really thank you for tuning in. Today, I had the absolute privilege of sitting down with one of the most influential minds in spine biomechanics, a man whose groundbreaking research has really transformed how athletes, clinicians, and movement specialists approach back health and performance, Professor Stuart McGill. If you've ever searched for a solution to pain, maybe you've explored ways to enhance physical performance, or you've sought out clarity on the elusive concepts of core stability, you've likely come across Dr. McGill's work. With over 245 peer-reviewed papers, multiple game-changing books, and decades of research, his contributions have reshaped the conversation around spinal health. And for me, his work has been deeply personal. It wasn't just about biomechanics, it was about challenging my own understanding of movement, questioning assumptions, and diving into the mechanics of the human body in ways that when I was young, I hadn't even explored before. So in this episode, we're going to break down the misconceptions about his super stiff definition and uncover some practical takeaways for both athletes and individuals dealing with back pain, and touch on the controversies that have sparked debate within the scientific and clinical communities because of his work. We're going to explore his legacy and his research, from his revolutionary findings of his 1986 Volvo award-winning paper on L4-5 dynamic movement, to his ongoing insights in injury prevention, spinal stability, and load distribution. And while he did retire a few years ago, he is one of the most sought-after educators in resolving back pain today. And whether you're a clinician, an athlete, or just somebody passionate about understanding the mechanics of movement, this conversation promises to be a deep dive into the future of spine health and what it takes to truly bulletproof your body. So grab a glass of water, maybe a notebook, and let's dive into this amazing conversation with Professor Stuart McGill. Well, Stu, thank you so much for joining me on Anatomical Gangster. I've really been looking forward to this since I finally had the pleasure of meeting you in person at the Fascia Research Congress in Montreal 3 years ago. So it's nice to see you again, first of all. Thank you.
I remember our dinner that we had, and then you sent me an email about this, and I see you're now a Naples girl, so you're
I
getting
know.
off.
I know. I'm living in paradise. I needed some freedom from New York, and I'm better for it, for sure.
Yeah,
For
very good.
sure.
I've
Yes.
been to Naples once, and I was impressed in that there was um, uh, a Bentley dealership next door to a Bugatti, and I've never seen that except in Scottsdale, Arizona.
People do have very nice cars here, and I know that you're also somebody who likes being on the water. You'll have to come down and visit, and we'll send you boating. It's really fun down here. It's quite
I
beautiful. There's,
love boats and I love water.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. There's just dolphins everywhere, and it's spectacular. Well, you know, Stu, I want to start this off by saying your work has been very influential to me. When I got into fitness in the mid 80s, and then in the 1990s when I was going through school, I discovered one of your research papers, and I think it might have actually been one of the first ones from you, because after I read it, I went to try to find more research from you, and I didn't really find anything back then. But it was actually a very groundbreaking research paper on the L4, L5 dynamics of the L4 dynamic moment into the contributing components of the discs, the ligaments, and the muscular forces. And you were sort of analyzing how each structure plays a role in spinal stability and load distribution during lifting, I think was what it was. And by the way, by those of you guys who are listening to that and you're like, what's a dynamic motion? He was referring to rotational force and torque that acts upon the joint during motion. So I want to know, how does somebody actually go to the point of
not only that research paper, but I think you have like 250 research papers. So I would love to hear first, how did you get here? What initially drew you to the field, and what was your starting place?
I, in high school, would have been the last person anyone would have picked to become a professor. Uh, I didn't want to go to university in the first place, but I ended up going. Believe it or not, I enjoyed playing football. And I then went on and did a master's degree, and then I applied for a PhD in systems design engineering. I was playing hockey with the professors team at the University of Ottawa, which is where I did my master's. And we played University of Waterloo, and I sat beside in the dressing room afterwards a professor from Waterloo, and he said to me, "Oh, you're coming to Waterloo?" And I said, "Yes, I've applied for systems engineering, and I'm going to be starting there." And he says, "Well, I'm just starting a spine lab. Why don't you come and visit?" So I went down and visited. I borrowed a car and drove to Waterloo, and he said, "Well, stay at my house for 3 days and just see what's going on." Anyway, long story short, I switched to become his first graduating PhD student in spine biomechanics. So it's as dumb a story as that. And I've always been the type who's curious about how things work. So it was fabulous to start taking a structure like a spine that uh, has all the various materials, properties of the different parts, and how it all fits together to create this wonderful flexible rod that allows us to tie our shoes and dance and whatnot, and then transforms into a stiffened I-beam to allow a power lifter to squat 1,300 pounds, which is what the current world record is. Or how does the spine blend all of this material properties plus athleticism to throw 130-mile-an-hour fastball or to hit a tennis ball 130 miles an hour, or to sustain a posture as long as it does. Anyway, so I just, that's the way my brain thinks. And I pull it apart and figure out how it works, how it becomes injured, what makes it have optimal function. How would I assess and work with my clinical colleagues to create clinical tests that they can use to gain the same insights as to why the patients are coming to them with back issues? How to rehabilitate and encourage through mechanostimulation, nerves flowing, fascia developing the right tone and stiffness. We can talk a lot about that. And then finally, what is it that allows an athlete to be that one person who can do something that no one else on the planet can do? And I've measured quite a few of those spectacular beings in quite a number of sports, and I've learned a lot. So that's just the story of curiosity. And when an athlete would come and ask me to help them, I didn't say no.
I love that. I love that. And I know that, when you talk athletes, you really span a gamut. And a lot of your research papers that I had read originally, you're really talking about kind of Olympic lifters, very big weight lifters, rather than these, like a dancer, a dynamic movement athlete. But it seems like a lot of your work, and you sort of said it at the beginning of what you were saying, is about this beautiful system that we have, this incredible spine with all these parts. And there needs to be some form of elasticity, but more stiffness. And some critics do suggest that your work advocates for a stiff spine. I've heard you say the super stiff, even. That's really a requirement for performance. So I think when people hear stiff spine, they think flat out rigidity. I don't think that they're actually, I always think, have you actually read his work? And I probably not. So I'm curious, can you address this interpretation? What does your research actually say about spinal stability, spinal stiffness, and spinal mobility?
That's thanks for the opportunity. I will say it's partly my own fault in that I assume people I'm talking to understand what stiffness is, and I didn't define it, so I'll do that now. But it's not entirely my fault. There are some people on social media who, for their own motives, say, oh, McGill just stiffens people, to dismiss what we do and then promote their own. So let me start out this way. Context really matters. So let's start with the context and the word stiffness. My coffee cup has a mass, so it has the property of having mass. It is very brittle, so that if I hit it with a sharp force and a sharp edge, it would shatter. If it was ductile and plastic, it would deform slowly. So these are all properties that every material has. Every material has the property of elasticity, stiffness. So I just happen to have a knee band here for training for squats. It has a stiffness. Stiffness governs the relationship between the applied force and the distance that it will deform. So I'm going to apply a tensile force and it deforms that far with about 20 pounds, let's say. If it was stiffer, it wouldn't deform as far. If it was less stiff, it would deform much bigger. So stiffness is only the material property that links deformation to applied load. That's all.
Simple.
Yes, but it goes way beyond that. Let me put this in a human body. The human body uses stiffness to control motion. Think of a healthy knee. It rotates back and forth under the guidance of stiff ligaments, the ACL, PCL, etc. If you damage that ligament, it loses its stiffness. So now when the knee rotates, you get a little micro movement in shear. So how would you like to stiffen that joint back again and make it work properly?
Can we do that without a surgery?
Some people can, but let me go to a spine, which is the thing I'm very comfortable talking about. I'm not so comfortable talking about a knee. So there's a pelvis, a pelvic ring, and the first three lumbar vertebrae. So L5, L4, L3. This joint is normal. L3, L5 is normal. L4 has been damaged. It's lost stiffness. Now watch, I'm going to apply a general torque from above. Do you see that there's not much motion going on at L3? There's a tiny bit. There's a tiny bit going on at L5, but look at the micro movements in shear at the joint that has lost stiffness. Look at the facet joints associated with that level. They're painted red because they're so angry. Now, that person has lost stiffness. That's what we measure in people when they've got disc bulges and loss of disc height and whatnot. So do you think it's that far-fetched to say, let's add stiffness and arrest that micro movement and the pain goes away? Because this person, when they lay on their side, because of the loss of stiffness, because of the joint damage, it cocks off to the side just a little bit. And they'll say, oh, when I lay on my side, I get this backache right there. And they can put their thumb on it. And then my right foot goes to sleep. Aha. Let's put a bolster under your waist on that side. Take out the micro movement. In other words, we make up for the loss of stiffness. Oh, doc, you're magical. Push your right heel away, align that. My ache is gone, and now my foot numbness has also been arrested. Now let's teach them some muscular bracing. Add a little tone to the abdominal wall, and all of a sudden now that forms a barrel, and we arrest that micro movement. So when they bend forward, they bend through the hips. All their back pain is gone. So I'm not apologizing for saying, yeah, we will restore stiffness back to the level that's required to arrest the pain-causing micro movement. There you
Yeah,
go.
makes complete sense. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Stu, because what I've understood about the words stiffness, elasticity, tone, stress, relaxation, and creep are very much a fascial concept. And so even with a disc, because that is a connective tissue, what I'm to understand is that Stiffness is about the ability of a tissue to resist distortion when stress is applied. That's pretty much what you're saying. And elasticity is not about how far something moves, it's about how quickly it returns to its ideal shape. And the balance between the two is the tone of tissue. And so it sounds to me like most athletes, in this particular instance, if they have something like this, is that the tissue tone has failed, and that could happen for a myriad of reasons: muscular imbalances, repetitive motion, injury, blah blah blah, whatever. But is that fair to say that stiffness is the ability for tissue to resist compression when stress is applied?
I'm hedging on that because when you compress a spine, because of its architecture, you're actually putting the collagen fibers into tension because they're holding a pressurized gel inside. So it's kind of interesting. The structure of the spine, when you load it a certain way, creates many other loads that help supporting. But what stiffness also does, and you've heard me use this word, super stiffness. So let's have a little bit of a talk about fascia. When I first started over 45 years ago, we created a very detailed biofidelic model of the spine. The computer was at its limit of its ability in those days. In fact, it took 24 hours to grind through 1 second of real-time analysis of the spine. That's
amazing.
Yeah, that was the computing power that we had in those days, but also the complexity. We would take an MRI scan of a person's spine and serially stack all the slices to create their spine. Then we would put on EMG electrodes measuring the muscle activity, so that would drive their virtual muscles in the computer. We would measure the three-dimensional deformations of the spine and the joints and put those into passive stresses on the modeled spine. In other words, the spine was able to mimic how the person was moving and the motor patterns that they were creating with their muscles. And we were looking for stress concentrations. Guess where the pain was? At the stress concentrations. You do that. Guess what? What part of my thumb or what part of my hand hurts? It's the part that I've just created the stress concentration at. So, it was so clear to us. But then remember, I was a young professor assigned to teach introductory biomechanics to the undergrads as my first course. And I would teach them, well, when you do a bicep curl, the biceps and brachioradialis are the agonists and the triceps are the antagonists. And I taught that for a few years. And then with our modeling, as I just described, we were really good at predicting joint torques and tissue stresses and determining where the rupture would occur and all that sort of thing. If the motions were quasi-static, slow, as soon as we added speed, the model fell apart. So I thought, oh, the abdominal muscles, when they contract quickly, they don't have the efficiency of the back muscles. So we'll put a fudge factor of 1.2. In other words, we're going to make up for it with 20%. And then we get someone to move a little bit faster and throw a ball. Boy, our fudge factor went up to 1.4. We're 40% off. What's going on? And then the magic started to happen. We would take, one of my colleagues was a cardiac physiologist, and he would take rats and give them different diets and measure their cardiac changes. And then before they sacrificed the rat, which meant they finally killed it, he'd say, oh, well, here. And I would tease apart the fascia around their abdominal wall, and you would measure the force and stiffness of a external oblique contracting, and then the internal oblique, etc. And of course, all this work was done with my graduate students. I'm thinking this was Steve Brown, who's now a very well-known professor, was my grad student doing that work at the time. And then the magic occurred when we looked at the abdominal wall on the other side, where we kept it intact. And then we measured the strength there. But we knew what the strength of the three component muscles were. But when they bound up with the fascia, we got super strength and super stiffness. In other words, we created a mechanical composite. I didn't need fudge factors in the model. I only needed to understand that the role of the fascia throughout the body was turning all muscles into an agonist. And that's when the magic occurred. So these people who criticize stiffness, let's have some real scientific talks now about stiffness and how essential it is to create a mechanical composite in the body that's efficient. I can do a pogo jump. Well, if I use just muscle and turn on muscle maximally, I can't move. It's rigid. If I don't use muscle activation at all, you can't jump. But when you set the tone of the muscle just right, not only at the ankle joint, you squeeze the fist, you push the tongue to the roof of the mouth, you create a fascial jacket, an exoskeleton of stiffness throughout the body. Boing, 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 boing. All you have to do is watch girls skip in the schoolyard and you see the most beautiful display of tuned stiffness, storage and recovery of elastic energy. And now all of a sudden, I understood how you throw a fastball, how you can jump rope, how a knockout is created in the UFC, how you resist a knockout by keeping the fascia of your neck tight and locked. The last third of my career, even though I understood the components of it. I'm sorry, I'm getting too excited about this, but
I love it though. It's so great to
I-
see somebody so passionate about what they do and explain such a complicated thing in such great words. So keep going.
well, I didn't quite put it together until I retired. And you know Bill Parisi.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course.
So Bill, he doesn't give up easily. And he would keep inviting me down and keep pushing me about this super stiffness concept. And he kept forcing me to develop it simply by asking questions. And I hope I'm not a bullshitter. If I don't know, I don't know. But he kept forcing me, and I'd say, Bill, let me think about this. Let me do another experiment. And it kept coming together. And all of a sudden, it just hit me that this stiffness forming a mechanical composite creates a resilient body that I can slip and fall on ice. Well, if I just took a pelvis and I took all the fascia off and through body weight, I was an expert witness in a legal case where a lady was sitting down in a bowling alley and this jerk came up behind her and pulled the chair out behind her and thought it was funny. She broke her pelvis and shear fractured her spine. So I had to do all these calculations for the court. Do you think they accept second best? No, you got to be on. If the jury and the lawyers are holding your feet to the fire, you better know your stiffness. The
That's
critics,
right.
I don't think could handle this level of holding your feet to the fire and being accountable. Anyway, it was the fascia, and you talked about load rate. If your pelvis hits concrete very quickly, it won't break. It doesn't have time to deform. The stiffness holds it together. But if you push the pelvis into the floor slowly, it would smash to smithereens. So yes, the stiffness and the material properties of viscosity held together by this wonderful exoskeleton. It all just came together. So can I just finish that off just a tiny bit more in terms of a scientific explanation? Let's take a backhoe. So it's a tractor with a arm on the back that digs earth. Now I call it an arm because if you are an operator of a backhoe, this is the shoulder, this is the elbow, and this is the wrist. And some of them have a thumb on them to pick up a log, but those are the actual terms they use. Now, if you are a backhoe operator and you just start digging earth, it pulls the tractor around. You have to put down stabilizers. And that's what they're called. They're wings that come out hydraulically, lift the back tires off the ground to lock the tractor into the ground. This is called proximal stiffness. Now the home base is anchored and you can pull earth. Just like if you came up to me and pushed me, if you didn't have appropriate stiffness and control, you just push yourself away. But you control the stiffness, and in other words, you're firing from a battleship rather than a canoe. And that's what core stiffness and control does in a mechanical linkage. So now you turn your hips, the forces generated in the very powerful hips come up through the spine and unleash distally at the end of, in order to create distal athleticism, you must have core stiffness.
That's
So
right.
this word, stiffness, and when people criticize it, I think if they went back to biomechanics class or engineering school or whatever it is and truly learned what these material properties are and how the fascia exploits these in beautiful synergies to unleash performance.
Yep.
But I defy any of them to explain to me tell me how your athlete can throw a ball 130 miles an hour. And I don't want to hear about agonists and antagonistic muscles,
For
because I can
sure.
assure you they do not have the strength as those constituent muscles to do the job.
That's right.
Here's the example.
Yeah.
Dan John, a friend, I don't know if you know Dan, but he says, this is a push. This is just a coconut person. This is an athlete. Bam!
Yeah.
You get the difference? You load it
Yes. And
elastically.
that's it. That's what I hear you saying. And I hope everybody's hearing this, because my background was in exercise science. And I had this very linear way of thinking. I got into a gym when I was like 12 years old. And I bought into this idea that, if you push as much as you pulled and you lift as much as you squat, you were going to like make a stronger body. But I've actually come to learn that in doing those kind of things, you can make a stronger, more dysfunctional body. And what I mean by that is they get better at managing their dysfunction. They don't actually improve anything. And in my education was so heavily weighted in biomechanics, I think I really gave a lot of power to the muscular system. And as I've gotten older, and what was a big discovery for me was when I had pain, I had the bottom of my foot hurt me, and it was plantar fasciitis. And I just thought, inflamed fascia, what the hell is that? And I went down that rabbit hole to understanding and deepening my understanding of what is the role that fascia does. It's not just a passive packing material. There's something else. And what I see fascia is a energy storing machine. It is the part of our body that, I'll give another example. A basketball player doesn't just bounce off the ground. No, they come down, their fascia stores the energy. So as they come up, the nervous system, because of that neuroelectrochemical passageway through fascia, it's now altering everything. So I think your nervous system actually knows how far you went up, so it knows how to control the load when you come down. And I think that when people are arguing the idea of stiffness, I think what they're not taking into consideration is that you're saying spinal stiffness as if it's the bone structure you're describing. And what I'm hearing you say today is that no, you're actually talking about the homogeneous system. And then you are also giving credit to how fascia stores energy, how there's dynamic motion, and that there's recoil. The body is winding up to create that velocity and to throw a ball, to squat, to jump, to sprint, whatever. But when you're talking about spinal stiffness, in many ways, you're not talking about the spine being stiff. You're talking about the stuff that holds stuff together as actually doing its job, which fascia needs to be stiff. You don't just want elasticity. You need a balance between the two. And the stiffness
Well,
of fascia,
stiffness
I think,
can
is
be
important.
high or it can be low. It's a property. It's
Right.
like weight. Weight can be high or weight can be low. But when people hear
Exactly.
stiffness, they think stiffness, no movement. That's not what
Right.
I'm
Right.
saying.
Right.
I'm saying stiffness can be high, it can be low, it's tuned. We did the only study, and this was with my graduate student, Jan Moorside, on Middle Eastern belly dancers. Well, if you want to see some spinal movement under control of stiffness,
Yeah.
go and study belly dancers. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and
But
that's it. Is you have so many research papers. I mean, I've seen research papers on kettlebell, on hula hoop, like you've done so many different ones. And in every instance, there's always that similar thread of, to me, it's about control. It's about involuntary control of the body, that when my system functions in an optimal way, uh, the body moves efficiently. And again, I think that there's this idea we call ideal alignment, right? And I always try to define this for people as it really is an idea, because I've never met anybody whose every joint is in ideal alignment, but I like the theory that when our joints align and there's joint centralization, there's going to be minimal force or torsion on any one given bone so that the body can dissipate force throughout the whole system. I like this idea. The problem is that most of us have at least one disc that's probably not functioning well, and our biomechanics are terrible because we sit too much and then we decide I'm going to go take a spin class or I'm going to go run 5 miles. But is our body even prepared for what we want to do? So I think that, you know, and you are just such a pioneer in the work of, I guess, understanding that concept. I just think that there's a bit of misconception. So I think, again, what's interesting to me is that you've contributed, again, over 245 or 50 peer-reviewed papers. You've got multiple books. You've created decades of research. You've had discussions on this. And again, a controversy, which I always think if somebody doesn't have controversy, they're really not saying anything new. So how did you, over these years, I guess, navigate differing opinions in the scientific and clinical communities, especially in the early years of your career? Because I think that there's a lot of people who want to put out research and then they get fearful over the controversy. But it seems to me like you just really didn't care and just kept going. But how did you navigate it as an early researcher?
Yeah. Boy, you do ask good questions, Sue. There's two parts to that. The first is how psychologically do you put your work up for peer review? Because, I had 40 graduate students over my career. There were quite a few of them who were so fearful to put their work up for peer review. They could be criticized, they will be, and emotionally, they couldn't put themselves there. So there's that. You need I just got better at choosing my graduate students, and one of the things I looked for was chutzpah. Do you know what that is? You know
Yes,
that.
chutzpah, I have that.
Yeah. So you have it. You've got to hold your ground a little bit if you have a strong foundation. So that is the second part. You got to have chutzpah to hold your ground, but it has to be in the scientific world based on evidence or fact, or at least some substantiated theory. So I had what we called the 6 pillars of evidence. The first laboratory was the one where we modeled each individual, created their virtual spine, figured out how they moved their spine so that it survived, performed, etc. Or it didn't, and now we know why they became injured. The second laboratory that we developed was a cadaveric laboratory. And I get criticized, oh, McGill uses pig spines. Well, yes, we needed a model where I could raise 50 identical spines of pigs, all the same genetic material, so we could do controlled experiments. Well, of course, a pig isn't a human, so we would take our rare human spines that we would obtain to calibrate the things that we found on an animal model and calibrate it up. Every disease and injury known to man has animal models to develop the concepts to test. The third lab, I realized I needed a imaging suite. So we got a micro CT scanner, X-ray equipment, Doppler ultrasound, so we could watch muscles control, all of, a good imaging suite. So then we could link what we saw on the images with the alleged destructive scenario. Remember, again, I was the guy called to court to say, I remember this one case, this woman was murdered. And did this guy who was the suspect have manual strength in his hands to break her neck in the way that it was broken? Someone has to answer these questions for the jury. Anyway, that was the third pillar of evidence. The fourth was I created an experimental research clinic. So every patient who came in, as a patient with back pain, we would assess them very thoroughly for about 3 hours. We would give them our convergence on what the pain pathway was, and we would give them a program to address the cause, desensitize the pain, and retune their body strategically appropriate stability, mobility, strength, endurance, so that they were robust to activity without going near their pain. So, you know, instead of, if it was a spine bending mechanism, we would teach them how to hip hinge, etc. The next lab was, and by the way, that's the only clinic I know that every single patient who ever came was followed up. So we know exactly our clinical score. We know what they were subcategorized with. We know what we gave them to do. We know if they complied. Like 6% of all the people we ever saw never did anything about our recommendations. But we know exactly all of these statistics. We know what subcategories of back pain get better and respond. And we know what others just linger. They're difficult, but the patient has to manage them. They're not going to cure themselves of it. Anyway, what are we now? That's the fourth pillar. The fifth pillar was epidemiological studies. So we would take groups like the Toronto Police Force, and we would see, we did very detailed half a day of fitness testing on them, lifestyle assessment and that kind of thing. And we followed them for 5 years. Who got occupational back pain? Do you think it was the really fit ones or the not fit ones at all or the middle of the road? As it turned out, the fittest ones were getting injured. They were hurting themselves in the weight room by overtraining. And then the weak ones who were unfit for duty, they also got hurt. But the middle of the road, it was an inverted U-shaped function. There was a resilience to having sufficient fitness, sufficient stiffness, sufficient.
Yeah, people overtrain. People are exhausted. I mean, most of my athletes, I'm like, what's your recovery day look like? And they're like, you mean like a day off? And I said, well, if you want to call it, like, what is recovery to you? They're like, where I just don't train 1 day a week. I'm like, so what do you do to recover? And they'll say, I don't train. And I think to myself, that's it? You do, don't do. I mean, that doesn't sound like a recipe for healing anything. You're overtrained and you're under restored. You need to replete your body every once in a while and not just not do the do, but actually do something else. That's how you create a successful athlete. But you're right. They're a rare breed, and they are some of the times the most dysfunctional people I work on.
Yeah. Anyway, the sixth pillar was clinical trials. So let's see if we really know our stuff and are people responding. So to answer your question, how do you withstand the criticism as a young scientist? When you do an experiment, you are the world's expert, no one else. You know, I listen to these people, they read our studies. And then they start pontificating about, oh, what McGill found, what not. Really, when you write a research paper, you write about 10% of what went on. You
Right.
learn all kinds of other things that you're not allowed to put in a research paper because basically it's one hypothesis and one finding. You can't, that's why I wrote textbooks, because I was so frustrated with just one item per paper. I wanted to tell the story and put together the whole thing in a textbook. But if you have the science, that gives you your foundation to hold your ground a little bit. And
Well
if you
said.
want to argue the science components, then that's fine. And then you do the next experiment now. So, you know, I would listen to critics, and sometimes, quite often, there was an element of truth in their criticism. Okay, that's fair. I'm not, you accept that and you say, okay, what will give me the insight that I need to now go to the next part of the developing knowledge. So you know, they were very much a part of the development. They drove the research program because the next thing that we experimented on was to help answer the last thing where I had to say, I don't know the answer to that, but give me a year. Give me a
Yeah.
year and I'll
Yeah.
be able to come back with that answer.
You know,
Anyway,
you keep saying this word, and I think it's important for people to also hear this word context, because social media is making people mental. The context. Sometimes I see somebody write something and they're talking about something, but they've taken it so far out of context that they sound convincing until, and if you didn't know about what they were kind of really pointing to, where you're like, wait a minute, that's like apples and oranges. You're taking things out of context. That has got to happen for your work, is just that people are taking things out of context if there's controversy. That's what I kind of think, it's semantics of some sort. Do you agree with some of that?
Yes.
Especially for social media?
Well, I'm not on social media.
Smart.
Well, I honestly, if someone is a lot on social media, they're not doing their work. You
That's right.
cannot do your work and be active on social media, is my opinion.
Yeah.
And I'm very wary of a loudmouth on social media on
Yeah.
any topic.
Mm, well,
I want to find
there's a
out
lot of
who.
them out there.
Yeah, well, of course there is.
A lot of them.
There's a little bit of intellectual laziness, I think, in the whole culture. And if you want to be marketed to, go listen to social media, and they will market to you. And
Big
I
egos.
wish you all the very best.
Big egos. It's something else you were talking about when you first did your research, and back in the 80s, there's not a lot of technology was there, but now with AI and all of the technology that we have, if you were to look ahead, what areas of spine health and biomechanics do you believe are actually going to grow because of AI? Or do you think that AI might get in the way? What's your take on AI in general?
I'm not qualified to answer that. I'm still
Okay.
trying to figure that out myself.
So looking ahead at biomechanics in general, do you believe that there's still more research and innovation that's going to happen with spine health?
Yes, is the short answer. What we did in the lumbar spine took me 45 years of 10 hours a day, every single day, working on the lumbar spine. I think if someone wanted to do that on the neck, that would really be a big contribution. So, every day someone will say, well, is there anyone that does what you did for the low back on the neck? And the answer is, I don't know anybody.
Yeah.
So how does the neck really work? What are some of the best diagnostic tests? What are some of the compromises? Anyway, sort out the neck. And one of my, well, I'll call him second in command here at BackFit Pro, Dr. Ed Cambridge. He is so much better than I on the neck, and he's slowly working away at it. But that would be another huge step, I would say. Does it really need AI? I don't know enough about it to answer that.
Yeah, I see what they're doing with AI, and I think that just even some of the graphic generation that we can create to, to really see what's going on in a body, I think it's going to deepen our understanding of all those nuances of the spine, because the spine isn't just a, there's all these different mechanical potential that the spine has, and if it doesn't, problems. If it has too much, problems, right? So there's a sweet spot for everyone. And you were the keynote speaker at the Montreal Fascia Research Congress. And I remember seeing that and thinking, that's awesome. Stuart McGill is in the fascial world. I always think of you more biomechanics, musculoskeletal, not that you can separate the two, but was there a defining moment for you where your appreciation or understanding of fascia shifted because of the emerging field of fascial research, or was this always a thread in your work?
What a great question. I was asked to do that keynote probably for the last 6 or 7 congresses.
I know.
And I always said no.
Yeah.
I said, I am not qualified to give a keynote on fascia. And each year they would ask me, and each year Bill Parisi would be asking me questions, and he brought it out of me. I probably knew more about fascia than I realized, but I hadn't put together the unified story yet,
Mm.
and I didn't feel qualified. But finally, um, Mark Driscoll
Love him.
who was our host,
Mhm.
a terrific professor. And I was following some of his work, and we had some conversations about the parallels in our work. And I realized, well, maybe I do have a little bit more data than I realized. So it was them who brought me along and forced me to unify my ideas and to be able to tell a unified story. But I don't know if you remember that lecture, but I think I started it by saying, I don't think I'm qualified to do this lecture, but here's my best shot at
Yeah.
telling a story.
I thought it was great. It was probably one of the more compelling, animated, clear cut, and the visuals you showed. I just remember everybody was pretty blown away by that. And it was very fitting to actually see you being such a biomechanic expert speaking on a level of bringing the concepts of fascia and sort of threading it into your work in a different way than I think I'd ever heard before. And it really, I mean, it was very inspiring what you did. And I mean, the career that you've had, the amount of people that you've helped, I'd be curious, is there a defining client or a story that you have of maybe an elite athlete or maybe even an everyday individual that was a memorable case or a moment that really stood out to you in your career?
Don't know if this is the right answer, but my life is a fairy tale, Sue. I was never supposed to be anybody. I've been asked by royal families to, I've seen kings, presidents of countries, the richest business people on this planet, uh, the most elite of elite human specimens in sport. And it's been so fascinating for me to be able to, it's like a car mechanic who gets to drive an F1 car one day, a Baja Desert Racer the next day, a monster truck the next day, all the forms of vehicles they get to drive and play with the mechanics and whatnot. So I've, as I said, I've lived a fairy tale to be able to do that. But having said that, when a person comes and I wake up to those emails every day, dear professor, I've seen 12 different clinicians. I went to the pain clinic and they told me the pain is in my head. I don't think it's in my head. I think it's in my back. But if it's in my head, that means I'm crazy and I'm going to blow my brains out. I cannot stand being crazy. But I hear you're a bit different. Would you see me? Now, there's some pressure for you. And it's those cases where that person will contact me sometime later and say, thank you, you changed my life. And, I'm glad I prevented lead poisoning. And those are, it's fascinating to see what a king or a dictator or someone who has such obscene amounts of money that it has no meaning,
Yeah.
how they are to interact with when they're in pain.
Yeah.
And then the real jolly is when, that teenage girl now has some hope, or your mom, or my mother, or those are the ones that are probably, those are the ones that give you a lump in your throat.
Yeah, yeah. When you change somebody's life and they tell you so, it really sometimes when I hear that too, I think to myself, that can't possibly be so. And they're like, your method, Melt, changed my life. This is, I've been in pain for so long and that changed me. And I always want to give it back to them. I said, well, you changed yourself. You made the decision to try something else. And that's so powerful because I think you're right. If you can just even crack the thought of hope that there is a potential to change. I think that's the big thing that really transforms people more than anything. Yeah. It's big stuff. Before I wanted to go back one more time about fascia because there really has been a growing discussion on fascia's role in load distribution and force transmission. This is a big topic now. There's more and more people very enamored with fascia. In fact, sometimes it's kind of annoying even for me because you can't just I feel like, okay, we can just talk about fascia, but are you talking about fascia and its relationship to what, right? So how do you think this interplays with muscular activation patterns in the spine and fascia's role in load distribution and force transmission?
This may or may not answer your question, so tell me if I'm getting too far off topic, but I'm just thinking of a patient who was here. By the way, you're in BackFit Pro here. This is just my little corner where I do podcasts, but if I can turn my camera around, I should have turned the lights on, but there's
Oh, wow.
assessment center back in the corner over there. And
Yeah.
we had a person on the table there, and they said, I get these weird radiating symptoms going down the left side of my body. And I was able to provoke them. I would tension the neural tract down their left side, but then I would pull their arm up over their head and they'd say, oh yeah, there's my pain. And then I would turn the palm of the hand. Just went away. Oh yeah, there it is. Down the left side into their foot. Well, what's connecting all of this? A little fascial tether, perhaps, to a nerve. But anyway, I've become so much better clinically at pulling and unraveling these difficult cases where a mechanical change in stress in one part of the body creates pain in another. Now, a few years ago, they say, "Well, this is bizarre. They're a bizarre mental patient, and they have these really weird pain reports where you do this and they get a cluster headache and they do something." No, if you understand neurodynamics together with the biomechanics, together with the fascial planes and lines, and how I just affected my psoas tension. Ah, now I understand why when they squat, they shift to one side, or when they are in bed and they roll a certain way, this triggers the common symptom. And it's the same, it's repeatable. But now we've been able to unravel it. So I don't know if that answers your question or
Yeah.
not,
Yeah, I
but
think so.
yeah, it's uh, been, well, to me, a lot of fun. And I don't mean that in a sort of like a Frankenstein way, but it is. It's very fascinating for me to keep trying to hone my skills.
Yeah, there's definitely so many new things. So what frontier in spinal research excites you the most right now? Is there, I don't know, a question you still hope to answer in your lifetime or that you're hoping maybe another researcher might discover that you're looking for?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I just sort of plug along, and I'm not expecting any big breakthroughs from myself in my life anymore. It's what I do really work on though is trying to master the craft as a clinician. To, as I said, I'm going. Do you know who Michael Shacklock is? Who
I
wrote the
do.
Dynamics? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Michael, we've worked together before, but I've never even taken his course. But we play with things. He's visited here and whatnot. So I'm going to his course in September just to be a little student, and I'm kind of looking forward to it. And my daughter's coming with me because
Ah,
she's a clinician as well,
so
and
fantastic.
yeah, so it's just little things. And
Yeah.
this, as I keep telling the young clinicians, if I'm lucky and I see a patient when I'm 90, that's going to be the best consult I ever did, because that will be the pinnacle of my clinical mastery. And every patient I work with, I learn a little bit more, hopefully. And problem is my forgetter works better than my rememberer these days.
Yes. Well, but that's so beautiful because I always feel like I'm a lifetime student. When somebody says, "Oh, you're an expert in this," I'm like, "No, actually, I'm not. I'm not an expert in anything. But I'm consistently learning and I'm always open to learning new things And even changing my mind about stuff that I really believed for a long while, and that sometimes short circuits my brain a little bit. But I feel like, if you keep an open mind and an open heart, it's kind of a great way to exist in life in general. I'm curious, what did you actually, who were your primary influencers when you were younger, when you were first learning? Who were some people, some notable educators that really you were like, that's awesome?
My high school football coach would be number one, Mr. Colucci. He made damn sure we worked hard. And there was an integrity there. I'll just tell you a little story about him. We were about the only high school football team that would practice on Saturdays. So you'd play Thursdays or Friday. And he owned, his dad owned a plastering business. And he would come in. So he'd call football practice Saturday morning, 10 o'clock in the morning. He would come in 9:30 and everybody's getting out of bed and moping around, and he would come in with fresh plaster in his hair, meaning that he'd already been out since 4 or 5 in the morning doing plastering.
Wow.
Yeah, working for his dad. And that used to just impress the hell out of me. And we would have ran through a wall for him. So that was probably my first mentor. And I went to university not wanting to go to university. I went to, I'm hesitant to say this because I wasn't a good athlete, at least at an elite level. So, I was just a reasonable high school football player that somehow made it to a university team. But anyway, I took a mathematics course, which I couldn't understand in high school. Professor Klambauer, and he would, he made calculus just come alive.
Mm.
So, I originally, I was quitting high school to become a plumber. And, I understood water flowing through pipes. And when you neck down a pipe, the velocity goes up and the pressure goes up. So that's calculus. Do you mean Mr. Klambauer? Calculus is only pipe diameter influences something else. That's calculus, rate of change. So then all of a sudden, I became a scientist. And then biology fused with physics, with chemistry, and the mathematics was just the description of it. So now all of a sudden I felt mathematics in my hand. And then I applied for a master's in biomechanics. I was going to do systems engineering in my PhD. And I told you the story.
And here you are.
Yeah. So I had mentors that appeared when I needed them.
Mhm.
And then my PhD supervisor, Bob Norman, was this guy who just had such integrity for science and the truth. And then my clinical mentors came into my life. One of the first ones, Dick Earhart, was a professor of physical therapy at University of Pittsburgh, and they would invite me down to Pittsburgh, and I was a young professor, and I would tell them what was new in biomechanics. But then I got to work with Dick for 3 days, seeing back pain patients, and I thought, well, this is fantastic. I don't see what you saw, but let me show you what I just saw. And he would say, holy smokes, I don't think like that. So all of a sudden, the scientist and the biomechanist got together with the artistic guru with the hands. Oh, Dick could feel a hip and he would know whether it was moving properly or whether there was an arthritic spur there. And I would say, show me what you just felt, Dick. And do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so there were all sorts of high performance Olympic coaches that I would learn from, many different clinicians, fellow scientists. It's been a fabulous journey.
Yeah, you really do. It's really amazing how many people you've influenced the lives of, certainly mine. I mean, really, you were such an influence on me in my early 20s, and just what I had read from you. I would also look at your bibliographies and go looking at their work also. And I think you made me think differently. And I really appreciate that you've put out so many peer-reviewed papers, because they have been very
You actually
influential. It's a
read
lot.
it's
a lot.
easier to read the books because the story
Well,
is
and your books are
I
great. I mean, yeah, I would honestly say that as well. Like the low back pain disorder, the evidence-based performance or prevention and
Yeah, low back
rehabilitation.
disorders. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the back mechanic, I remember that one. That's your step-by-step method of the McGill method. And that one also very influential to me because, you know, that's the great thing about books is that it's much more widespread reading instead of a research paper. Research paper, I mean, I don't think people really realize that research papers, you have a lot of exclusions, you know, you have to just look at this one thing, forget about all this other stuff. And if they have any of these things, they can't be in the study. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort even just to do research, but in general, thank you for that. Sure.
Reading scientific papers, if people are doing that, may I say one thing?
Yes, of course.
You'll see all kinds of studies that say, oh, posture doesn't matter, or posture really does matter. And, you know, you'll read a study on posture on non-specific low back pain. Of course, posture doesn't matter. But if you make the pain specific, in other words, if you separate out the people who, when they bend forward and slouch, that triggers their pain, guess what? Now you measure posture. It really matters. Do you see what I mean? So if you subcategorize and homogenize the groups, all of a sudden you start seeing statistical effect that was buried in the non-homogeneity of non-specific back pain. That's point number one. But number two is look at the variance. I give you an example. We did a study on volleyball jumpers. The coach came to us and said, an elite team, can you put 3 inches vertical jump on all these players? I said, well, I don't know, but let's run the experiment. So we gave them basically the same squat training program. Half of the team jumped higher after 3 months. 30% lost height on their vertical jump. 20% no difference. I thought, well, that's weird. On average, there was no difference. We repeated the study. We got almost exactly the identical answer. As it turns out, look at the variance. Now subcategorize. What was a feature distinguishing of the group that were the super responders? They responded to the squat training and they jumped higher. What was the features that defined the ones who doing squat training ruined their vertical jump? And, you know, we found if you ask the players, are you naturally quick or naturally strong? If you're naturally quick, go over there. Naturally strong, go over there. Guess what? We just found out who responded and who didn't. Naturally quick, you add a bit of strength, they jump higher. Naturally strong, you add more strength, you stiffened them and slowed them down.
Yeah, interesting.
You know, so when you read research papers, you have to study the variance, even in studies that say posture doesn't matter or, you know, squats don't matter. No, it's like, does coffee make you perform better? Well, there's some super responders to caffeine, and there's some people that it upsets them. And it's like this with every drug, every intervention, every spine treatment. Look at the variance. So this is very important for people to hear. So what I'm saying is when you read a unified work from a person, that's already done for you. But these people who, oh, they'll take a study from you or McGill or whoever, and they'll say, oh, you know, la-di-da-di-da, they pontificate about it. Son, do the work. Do the work yourself.
Do the work.
And find out what is really going on instead of reading other people's papers and being lazy intellectually.
Yeah,
and
yeah. It's just like people who poo-poo your research, oh, your paper, this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, where's your research paper? And then they don't have one. And I'm like, well, you don't
they
even know
don't have
what
one.
to do.
And they have no idea how to consume science in a mature way to get to a position to base an opinion upon to help people.
Amen. You know, and I also would want to say this about posture. I always think in life, we assume many postures, but we have one structure. So we should be looking at our structure rather than does alignment, is alignment all of it? It's really about how the structure is managing the alignment it has right now. And I am just going to keep saying, ideal alignment is an idea. It's an idea that science defined that when joints align at their centers, this is ideal. These are the 0 degrees. But who the hell is there? We're just as a human race standing up. We have every odd against us to not be in perfect alignment, to not have great posture. But does having great posture limit your potential to be an athlete? And I don't know. The answer is sometimes, because I look at my athletes and they are not anywhere near alignment. But if I tried to put them to alignment, I'd mess up their career. That's like, I would never do that right there.
Have you ever met a symmetric, well-postured baseball pitcher.
0.
They're zero,
Big
exactly.
0. You look
Right.
at them and you're like, wow, my neck hurts looking at you. So I love all of these. I mean, I could talk to you for hours. So, Stu, I ask everybody the same question on Anatomical Gangster. I'm going to throw this out to you. It's a question literally related to life. If you could tell somebody something that you've learned in life, a life lesson that really helped you, it changed some aspect of your life where you were struggling, and maybe if they heard you say these things, it might very well change somebody else's thinking and could potentially change their life, what would it be?
If you were to take me back to the lowest points of my life and what helped me at that time, read The Power of Positive Thinking.
Mhm.
It's a very old book, Norman Vincent Peale. I'm not good at reading religious material, but that's about as close as it comes for me. And at that particular time in my life when I needed a little bit of confidence or some guidance, there you go.
Indeed, the power of positive thinking is indeed something we should all care about. Well, Stu, this was such an honor, and I so appreciate you taking time out of your day instead of enjoying your boat or doing something fantastic, being outside in nature. But I genuinely appreciate you being here. I hope that everybody else has enjoyed this conversation, and make sure that you comment, you share this with your friends. And until I see you on the next podcast, keep your mind open, keep your heart open, and we'll see you all soon.